Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special session of the Africa Football Business Show. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are joining us today. First of all, is to thank you for taking your time to attend this special session, which has been organized by Javelin Sports Consulting and Palmas Sports. This being a special session, we are happy to have four guests with us, two of whom are going to act as facilitators and two panelists. So to facilitate this show, we have Ralph Mokwala from Javelin Sports and Jan Nel also from Javelin Sports. And our panelists today will be Shane Wefer from Javelin Sports and Dev Kumar Parmas, DKP from Parmas. A warm welcome to everybody. And before we go ahead with the show, just a special mention to our partners, starting with Palmas, who are here with us today, OTB Africa, CBeyond Leadership Forum, iSportLand, the Football Business Academy. We'd like to thank them for making this show possible. So welcome everyone to this show. At this point, I will hand over to our facilitators today. That's Ralph Mokwala and Jan Nel from Javelin Sports. Thank you.
Fantastic. Hello to everyone today. I'd briefly like to just thank Brian for that introduction. I'd just like to go back a second just to mention who we all are. So I am Jan Nel. I'm a founding partner of Javelin Sports. We are based in South Africa, but obviously we operate internationally. My co-facilitator for today is Ralph Mokwala, as Brian said. He's a practicing advocate and in-house counsel at Javelin Sports, and he will assist me in facilitating today's discussion. Our panelists today are my co-founding partner of Javelin Sports, Shane Wefer. He's a practicing attorney in South Africa, and he's very involved in the sports law scene, as well as doing a multitude of commercial agreements, both in the sporting world and outside. Dev, I was very fortunate to get to meet when I studied my master's overseas. He's a practicing solicitor in the UK, obviously also working on an international level with a wealth of experience before FIFA and UEFA's internal bodies, as well as the highest court in sports law, which is the Court of Arbitration for Sports, obviously. From there, I just want to see if anyone wants to add anything at this stage. But otherwise, I wanted to jump straight in and just sort of set the scene for today's discussion. Ralph will take it from there to explain a bit more about what the topic's going to be about. And then we'll hand this matter over to Shane and Dev to really get involved today in what we'd like to be a sort of an informal discussion, just to really get to the pressing issues with the topic of solidarity mechanism and training compensation payments. You guys happy for me to proceed? Okay. So basically, understanding football law within the sports law framework inevitably means going back to where did all the regulations start? Where did it come from? And everyone, I'm sure, listening today that's involved in the football world will know about the Bosman ruling, which was obviously a very key decision, meaning the players could move to a new club once their contract had come to an end without their old club receiving any compensation or fee whatsoever. The effect of this was obviously fairly simple in that clubs lost their power over players when their contracts expired, and the players could then just move on to new clubs. This is obviously a situation which clubs wanted to prevent, and it went into a situation where many clubs tried to tie players down for longer contracts or to insert controversial clauses such as unilateral extension clauses in these contracts. It was also seen as a large threat, this decision, obviously, because I'm sure many of our delegates today are involved in minor clubs, and obviously one of the most important aspects of grassroots football, academies. So obviously this was a threat because there was no longer any sort of financial incentive to be able to train players and really bring talent up through the ranks. So this obviously led to clubs and associations and stakeholders in the football world turning to the governing bodies of FIFA and UEFA in Europe, urging them to establish a set of regulations that would really regulate the transfer system as a whole. It obviously had to be compliant with EU law. That was the key. That was where this drive really came from at the time. But the most important was that it secured the rights of academies, clubs to be compensated once they've trained and developed these youth-level grassroots players that go on to then become professionals and sign their professional contracts and move around within the transfer system. This obviously was done in a document which, again, I'm sure everyone is fairly familiar with, the FIFA regulations on the status and transfer of players. This will be the big part of the discussion today, specifically, obviously, the provisions on training compensation and the solidarity mechanism. But to go back, these regulations obviously regulate the status of players. It's in the name. The eligibility criteria for players to participate in organized football, and regulating, obviously, player transfers between clubs. Especially important is that those are clubs belonging to different member associations. But again, our distinguished panelists will get into that. Just to go, an important note, like I've said, academies are vital to grassroots football. And when we mention clubs, this includes youth academies, and as well as the bigger professional soccer clubs. So these regulations, Ralph will speak a bit about what our topic's going to be now, but they basically go about outlining how clubs are to be compensated for the training and development of players who go on to be successful stars, obviously, or even not stars, but just successful footballers, and they sign their professional contracts and play the game as professionals. Ralph, I don't know if you want to take it from there.
Yeah. Thank you, Jan. Just to build on what you just said, I think as football lovers here, we all watch our favorite elite teams. And when you see a starting 11, you'll find that 3 or 4 of those players will have come from the academy of that club. So the rest of those players will come from transfers, many of them coming from other countries. So now, that then raises the question that those academies and minor clubs that develop those players, what's the incentive that they have to develop those players? Because depending on the size of the club, these clubs will spend from thousands into millions developing these players. And then so when these young players then come up and decide to join other teams and sign their first professional contracts at other teams, those academies and minor clubs will not make any money. So that then raises the question that how do these minor clubs recoup their return on investment? And that's the topic that we're covering tonight. I think it's a very important topic that does not get spoken about enough. I feel that um, all administrators, all coaches, and everyone that loves football should know about this because it's very vital to the development of the sport. Academies form the foundation of football, and a lot of our stars don't just come from all these big teams like La Masia Development Academy and all that. They come from smaller clubs and smaller countries. Um, so when those players leave those clubs become disadvantaged. So what FIFA went to do with the RSTP was to try and assist to to facilitate the transfer of these players to ensure that those teams get compensated so that those players don't just leave and those clubs and academies lose money. So the question that we're going to answer tonight is that how exactly is that facilitated? I won't delve too much into that because Dev and Shane know much more than me on this topic. I won't pretend to know it very well because yeah, those two guys are the experts. Um, what FIFA introduced with the RSTP, what the RSTP stands for, there is the regulation on the status and transfer of players. Um, what FIFA aims to do with that is to sort of facilitate the transfer of these young players when they sign their first contract to ensure that the clubs that develop them get compensated so that those players don't just leave on a free and those clubs lose the money they spent on those players. Um, if I could just sum up what the RSTP is that FIFA is just trying to get all the clubs to get along. The RSTP tries to regulate the compensation, how it's calculated, when it's paid, if any dispute arises, what exactly is the method of resolving the dispute. Um, yeah, so I will then leave this topic to Shane and Dev. I'll pass it over to them for them to cover this topic. Shane and Dev, please introduce us to training compensation and the solidarity mechanism. What is it? How is it claimed? Who can claim? When disputes arise, how exactly are they handled? So, gents, over to you.
Thanks, Rolf. And thanks to Jan for the introduction. Same to Brian. It's a pleasure to be on the African Football Business Show this evening to discuss understanding training compensation and solidarity. It's a pleasure to discuss this with Dev, who I'm sure a lot of people in the industry know all too well, an industry expert and someone who has represented a lot of the bigger players and clubs in the world, has a lot of experience in this field. So his insights will be valuable this evening. So in the context of this being the African Football Business Show, I'm a fan of numbers, and I always like to frame discussions off the back of some statistics and maybe some eye-opening facts that will allow our delegates and listeners this evening to understand the context which we bring this discussion to you. A lot of people that are listening now will have a general understanding of what training compensation and solidarity is. They might not know the minute details with respect to how to bring it over the line and how to essentially ensure that they are receiving what's due to them and what the RSTP was set up to provide to clubs. So quite staggering in actual fact when I read it now, and we'll discuss the topic in detail. I try not to get to stray too much from the topic, but it's estimated that in the last 10 years, there has been between $400 million and $1 billion worth of training compensation and solidarity claims that have been left on the table by global clubs. Now, as we are from South Africa, and if there are any South African listeners, that's between 6 and 16 billion rand that has not been claimed globally from clubs. Now, if you can believe that, and another statistic we'll talk about now is that the average player is only paid less than $1,000 a month, you can imagine how much money is being left on the table. Now, when we talk about African football in a holistic view, money is always going to be a topic of great discussion, and it's always generally the root of all evil. So it's quite interesting to learn that clubs are leaving so much meat on the bone, and there's so much money left out there which they can use for their development, but they're not claiming. Now, one of the reasons we are here to discuss this topic today is to understand why that is. Why are we leaving all that meat on the bone? Why aren't clubs claiming the compensation and solidarity which is due to them? There are various mechanisms which FIFA has created to assist clubs in making this easier for them. There are various RSTP regulations that allow the FA or FIFA to sort of conciliate disputes and reduce the costs and place a position before clubs. Essentially, a new club is obligated to make that payment. So the fact that they are not making that payment is something which we need to address. Now, does it come from the selling club or the buying club, which we'll get to at a later stage? But off the back of some great work done by FIFA Pro, as far back as 2016, with respect to their global employment report, some other statistics which are quite stark and quite incredible if we look at it in the general landscape, is that football is often glamorized by the media, and in terms of people seeing only the top and best players, such as the Ronaldos and the Messis and the Neymars, earning top dollar and living the top life that everyone thinks is associated with football. Now, FIFA Pro, off the back of the work they've done, were able to determine that less than 2% of players globally earn about $720,000 a year, while 45% of players globally earn less than $1,000 a month, which is $12,000 a year. Now, you can see the massive, massive discrepancy between the top echelon of football and the rest of football. 74% of players globally earn $4,000 a month. Now, considering that the majority of our development occurs in developing nations, we have over 50 players from Africa competing in the English Premier League. You can see that the discrepancy for me, in my opinion, and I speak on behalf of myself here, I see that this discrepancy creates a scenario for me which I don't want to call it a broken system, but something needs to be done to bring those two figures closer to each other. Now, if my maths is correct, and I do a few calculations here off the back of some interesting figures which we've got from FIFA Pro again, small clubs in the EPL, we're looking, and this is the English Premier League, we're looking at about an average salary of £2.5 million a year. The top echelon clubs were looking at closer to £8 million a year. Now, obviously, that's the best of the best players. It's an average. We obviously, a lot of the junior players are earning a lot, and the top players are bringing that average up. But if we look at what I said earlier, 74% of players globally earn about $48,000 a year. Now, if you take this figure and you correlate it to the lowest amount, which is £2.5 million a year in the English Premier League for players, we see that our players that are earning this $4,000 a month are earning 1.9% of the average of the players that the salaries of players in Europe. This goes at less than 1% if we're looking at the top clubs like the Manchester Cities. So the fact that players globally, 75% of them are earning less than 1% of the average in Europe tells me that there's a problem. There's a problem that needs to be addressed, and we need to figure out where is the money going and why are these top clubs able to pay their players as much as they are, whilst other clubs, 75% of global players, are not earning as much. Now, we will discuss this in depth and I'll discuss this with Dev, I'm not for 1 second saying that training compensation and solidarity is the answer to all our problems. We have to discuss sponsorship, broadcast rights, where the money comes from. So that all plays into why and how players can earn as much as they do, and why players in Africa might not be able to earn as much. But if we look at it from the grassroots level, and we look at training compensation and solidarity, it's a great place to start to understand if $10,000 on the bone here, it might affect the greater picture. So it might be small figures for now, and with the smaller development clubs and the academies, some people might say, oh, well, it's only a couple of $1,000, why should I spend money to try and get that money back, or it's too much effort, and, I don't want to back club. Or so these are all questions, these are all excuses which we hear as to why there is so much money being left out there. Now, for 3/4 of the world's players to earn as little as they do, I don't think the system will be able to stay together. It won't continue to work going forward if this is the dispensation and the way it stays. So another, and this will be my final little statistic here before we get into the actual meat of the discussion, is that when you look at it holistically and you look at the FIFA Pro Employment Report and what it actually revealed, you can see there are various problems which we pick up with associations and clubs, such as contractual rights, labor laws not being applied to in various jurisdictions. But one of the key things I picked up is that 55% of players in Africa experience overdue payable issues with their clubs. Some of these issues and overdue payables stretch as far as 12 months. Now, we discussed this earlier, and I'd like to maybe kick off a discussion with Dev about this, but you immediately see that statistic and say, oh, 55% of players in Africa are not getting paid. Africa's got a problem with football. But no, it actually doesn't. If you look at the statistics holistically, 35% of players in Europe also experience that exact same problem, where overdue payables is an issue. So I'm not for 1 second saying, and a lot of our delegates are listening now saying, you mustn't dog African football, we aren't as bad as everyone says. And I agree with that fully. Africa is not as bad as it's made out to be if you look at other FAs from Europe and the rest of the world, which are tracking just a little bit behind us in terms of some of the issues we have. But if you look at those statistics, it's ridiculous that more than half of our players in Africa are not paid their salaries on time, and some of them have to wait almost a year to receive their salaries. So you see there's almost a golden thread that runs through the issue we're discussing here, is that we need to look in depth at what the problem is and how do we fix it. So if we look at football administration, why are players not being paid? Because FIFA Pro report reveals that less than 0.5% or less than 50% of players actually have their contracts in front of them when they sign it and keep copies of and records of their contracts. So this creates an issue going forward as to how to claim that money if there's an issue. Now, if we take that across to the training compensation and solidarity discussion here, we see that it's not just training compensation and solidarity. There's various other aspects of the football dispensation where we need to address these issues and correct them. So not to delve too much on statistics and to actually get to the topic, training compensation and solidarity is dealt with in terms of the RSTP, as mentioned by Ralph and Jan. Section 20 and 21. Now, we can discuss the definition, as we discuss the topic, but I don't want to delve too much into the details of training compensation and solidarity with respect to understanding it holistically in the football landscape. Perhaps if there's some questions which pop up and we want a general understanding of, word for word, what training compensation is there for, what solidarity is there for. But essentially, Ralph touched on it earlier. We need to compensate clubs that have trained and developed youth players for the work they've done. So if we do not, essentially we're shooting ourselves in the foot by not allowing our development clubs to grow and to grow grassroots football on the continent and in each FA. Now, training compensation applies to players under the age of 23 that have signed their first professional contract, and thereafter that continue to sign below the age of 23. Now, discuss again whether or not international domestic transfers apply, and there are various discrepancies which might come into play in various FAs. But with respect to solidarity, we're looking at a slightly more, some might argue complex, some might argue that training compensation is more complex, but 5% of the transfer fee when a player is transferred internationally on a professional contract would be due to the selling club. So those are the mechanisms which FIFA has introduced as far back as 2001 after the Bosman decision sort of threw a spanner in the works. And FIFA set up this dispensation to allow clubs to be compensated for the work they do in developing players to try and help grow the system. So we'll touch again on how we facilitate a training compensation claim, how we facilitate a solidarity mechanism payment, the categories for payment, and how an association will work together with its clubs to get that over the line, what a club or academy needs to do. And essentially, the root of all evil is record keeping and proper administration, which we'll discuss. But I think I'd like to just give Dev an opportunity to introduce the topic and give us some insight into his experience in the football landscape in Africa and how he experiences training compensation and solidarity when viewed globally and in the African context. Thanks, Dev.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Dev, if I can just jump in there for a moment, I promise you'll get your turn. I see that Brian has posted it in the comments section. As Shane said, if you guys have any questions, you can post them in the comments section. We will either handle, especially if they're very specific to the part of the topic we're handling at the time, we'll try to handle them on the fly. Alternatively, we will perhaps leave some for the end or for a point in the discussion where we think they're more suitable. Ralph and I will try and remember which ones those are and bring them up at the appropriate times. And I just want to say thanks to Shane. You know, statistics can sometimes be a daunting issue, but I think something Dev's definitely going to get into. You know, it's about, we have experienced a lot, and I'm sure many of the delegates know that sometimes it's about, is it worth it? You know, it's not really going to change much. But I think the change that Shane's sort of getting to is, effectively, you need to build up these football economies. That is the only way to go from strength to strength. And for that, it needs to be treated like a proper business. Now, this can get extremely difficult in the field of academies because we've come across a host of academies, you know, that are really in it for the love of the game. They're in it for developing and so on, and they're not really looking for a financial reward. And that's fine. But sometimes it's about using your resources, making sure you bring them in, have a certain amount of business efficacy, just to ensure that you can, you know, keep your bills paid, invest more in your academy, give more back if that's what you want. And if it's financial profit, these are also some of the systems, as Shane said, that can just be an excellent starting point. But now I can see Dev is chomping at the bit, so take it from there, Dev, if you have anything to add.
No, thank you very much, Jan. And it's been great to listen to you guys. So far from chomping at the bit, I'm happy to watch you guys move on. If I may, just very briefly, for risk of taking credit of something I'm not a solicitor in the UK. I was trained at the bar. Without going into all of the peculiarities of the English legal system, there's a division between the two. So I'm not a solicitor. I was a barrister. Or I am a barrister, but we practice primarily in international sports law now. So I don't operate at the English bar, so to speak. We only work in sports, and this is how we've been in the fortunate position to become acquainted with one of the fastest growing sports law boutiques on the African continent right now, which is Javelin. So thank you again, Shane and Jan and Ralph, for putting this whole session together. Francesco, ciao. It's great to have you on board. Thank you very much for your comment. Look, I think with training compensation, it's been spoken about so much that it would be foolish of me, dare I say, or foolish of us to simply repeat what is out there. However, despite all of the webinars, all of the expert sessions, the master classes that have been going on pre-COVID and particularly during COVID in the age of StreamYard and Zoom, there is still a lot of money being left on the table, as Shane rightly said. Now, the estimates may vary between 400 million and 1 billion, whatever it may be. It's still a huge and not insignificant amount of money. A lot of it being left on the table primarily from clubs in South America, Middle East, Asia, and Africa. So why is this money not being picked up? We've got to look at it in the most practical sense that we possibly can. Sometimes it's because clubs at the grassroots level or clubs at the pro level don't know that they're able to make this claim. However, from our experience working in presenting claims on behalf of clubs from many different jurisdictions, I would refute this to a great extent. I would say the vast majority of people within the football fraternity, within the football ecosystem, understand that they are eligible to make claims. I would suggest that the vast majority of these issues. Oh, sorry, George. Forgive me. I'll raise my voice a little bit more, and apologies for anyone that wasn't able to hear me as clearly. I would suggest that the vast majority of these clubs are not picking up the money that is due to them because they don't know how to make the claim, thus leading to them leaving the claim to go astray, or they make flawed claims, which mean that those claims are not going to be accepted in any case. And this is something that we see quite often. I don't want to sell the services of legal counsel, but there is a reality that ultimately, if you're not fully au fait with how to make a claim, then it is always advisable to speak to a legal expert or a sports law expert who can assist you with regards to how to do this. Because ultimately, if the football economy is going to grow, something that Shane and Jan have both touched upon, if the football economy is going to grow, it's going to be partially down to the fact that these claims for money that is actually on the table and people are eligible to receive, that these claims are realized. And they're going to be realized, not in every single case, but partially due to the fact that legal counsel will be instructed, will be appointed, will be sought out in order to ensure that money is going to the right destination. So I think that is the key point from my perspective, gentlemen, today, without simply talking about Articles 20 and 21 in the regulations and status of transfers of players. All of those that are on the call today, whether they're familiar with RSTP or not, you can go onto Google and you can find that document. We don't need to sit here and dictate all of that to you. But what we are here to try and assist you with is what do you do next? From a practical perspective, if your grassroots academy in DRC or in Guinea-Bissau or in Mozambique or wherever it might be has potentially got a claim due to one of the players that was formed at your academy between the ages of 14 and 17, let's say, moving on to La Liga or Ligue 1 or even the Ekstraklasa in Poland or whatever it might be, how do you go about getting that money that is allocated to you and is reserved for you, but is only reserved for a certain period of time because there is a limitation? And Shane, it may be that you'd want to pick up on this point and move further. There is a limitation. You have to make your claims within 2 years. If you don't make your claim within 2 years, then that money is going to disappear. And when it disappears, invariably, it's not coming back to your football economy and it's not helping your ecosystem. So I don't know, Shane, if that's something that you'd like to segue on from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could feed off the back of that. Look, like you've said quite rightly, Dev, that money is allocated to a club or an academy for a certain period of time. So it's not going to be there forever, which is why it's vital for a club or an association to understand the process that follows a claim and what they need to get that claim over the line, and perhaps what they need to do once that player has left the club. It doesn't end there. So according to the rules strictly, like never amount of time to claim that money. If you do not claim that money, technically speaking, the club's FA would then be entitled to receive that money and then hopefully feed that back into the development of football on a national level. We find that this doesn't always happen. So instead of the claim being tracked and the money not going to the club or the academy and instead going to the FA, the money just disappears into thin air. Obviously, a club that is not paying that amount, whether it be that they know they have to, and they circumvent that requirement because the selling club hasn't pushed, or they themselves are not aware of the claim and their obligation to pay. So 2 things I wanted to touch on, and which I'd like to take some time to discuss, and perhaps we could get in a bit of a back and forth here. Dev and Jan and Ralph, you're welcome to discuss this, is what we need to understand a training compensation claim specifically. We can look at solidarity too. But one of the main things, and in my experience, I've picked up, obviously we operate towards the southern end of Africa. I'm not speaking on behalf of all the FAs and clubs out there. There are plenty of them that do jobs far better than some. But I tend to find that record keeping becomes quite a problem with respect to who is in the club and what happens to that player when they move on. So one of the first requirements and the first documents which a club or an academy will require with respect to a training compensation claim is the player's registration card. Now, ordinarily, when a club or an academy brings a player in and that player begins to play, he's training with the club, that club or that academy ought to register that player. Now, when I say ought to, it's an obligation in terms of the National Association's rule. If a club does not register that player and he plays, they might find themselves in hot water. We don't want to face or find ourselves in a position where a club has points deducted or they win a competition which they might not have won had that player not played for them, or we have arguments such as that. So let's say the starting point is always registration cards of players. Please, can we always ensure, and this is just something which I push to all of our clients and I push to anyone that discusses any topics with us when it comes to ensuring proper record keeping, is get that registration card first and foremost when your player starts playing for you. Make sure you're registered with the FA and make sure you have that card. Now, keep that document or the registration card you have. I know nowadays everything stays in email, and then we can always Google search it or go back and search for a document which we know is there. But I would encourage our clubs to, in hard copy, print that document and have it in a file in the club for every player. Now, I know you're probably going to say to me, oh, well, I don't want to spend thousands of dollars on printing costs, and I don't want to cut down trees for all of this. Why do we need to keep it? But I can assure you that keeping proper records will help at a later stage. So that's point one. Always ensure you have the correct documentation and your registration card for a player. And then I think if we don't look at the meat in between then and what we're about to discuss now, I'd say the next thing I'd like academies and clubs to always ensure they do and keep records is what happens to their player once they've left. So we know that training compensation claims don't die once your player has left. Say, for example, you trained a player from the age of 15 to 17, 14 to 17. He's got 3 years with you, 3 years of money you spent training and developing the player, educating him, feeding him, sending him to camps, sending him on trials. You've spent time and energy developing that player. Now he's moved on. You may track him to the next club he moves on to and think, okay, from that point on, he moves on in his life. I don't need to track him any further. But what a lot of clubs and academies don't or forget or don't remember is that if that player were to have been transferred internationally thereafter for the third club, B to C, that academy and club is still entitled to training compensation for that transfer, which ought to feed back down to it. But the club or academy would never know if it didn't keep accurate records. Now, we can't assume that everyone will be honest and that everyone has integrity. That third club isn't going to come and find the academy or go back and check and say, hey, guys, we owe you 50,000 euros for training compensation. That's not generally going to happen. So what I would encourage clubs and academies to do is make sure they track their players moving forward and find out, where did my junior development player go moving forward in his professional career? So then you know, okay, I am due this amount of money. And yes, maybe I have 6 months left on it. I might get my lawyer involved, phone a dev or phone a Shane, phone Jan, and figure out, what do I need to do to get this claim over the line? Perhaps it could be, conciliating with the club and trying to sort this out amicably. But you wouldn't be able to do that unless you kept proper records and unless you knew that you were entitled to that amount. Now, I do want to discuss this with Deb. We'll maybe touch on it towards the end. I'm sure a lot of the clubs and academies are well aware that FIFA in 2019 introduced a dispensation that should and ought to allow us to have all of these records kept on our behalf, FIFA Connect and the transfer matching system, that should keep accurate records of where the players have been, where they are going, and their registration cards should all be stored on that system. But I think we can all agree, if you've used it and have worked with it in the past, since it's been set up, it's not 100% ready to go to market and to work properly and accurately yet. So until that day comes, we must ensure that our clubs keep their records personally on file until the time comes that the TMS and the FIFA Connect system works like a charm and it keeps all the records for us. I would encourage us to do that ourselves. Now, Dev, Jan, you guys have anything to comment on that? I think, in my opinion, those should be two of the most important aspects we should look at, just so that clubs are aware, okay, this is how many players I've trained, this is where documents I need if the time comes, and this is where they are being tracked as of now.
Definitely. I think, look, it goes down to the wider principle of governance, how you're governing your academy, right? Now, a lot of the stuff that Shane has just spoken about is boring, proactive stuff, okay? Keeping all your documents in place, making sure your registrations are in place. But without that, without doing all of the boring stuff from the outset, you as an academy manager or as a club owner or whoever it might be, you significantly reduce your chances of being able to make a successful claim in the future if one of your players has gone on. It's as simple as that. So when we talk about governance, and I'm pivoting ever so slightly, but when I'm honored to give lectures on governance in sports and in different parts around the world, it's often not seen as the most sexy topic within sports law. We can be honest about that. But the brutal reality is that governance is an income generator. Now, training compensation as a principle is not there to profit the grassroots clubs, okay? So we're going to pivot slightly from that as well. But income generation isn't always profit. Income generation is also recompense for time and effort spent, which is what Shane was talking about earlier. Esteemed Soccer Foundation, this is very good. I don't know if you're talking about that because I'm speaking, but it's probably because of everything you've heard from Shane and Jan. But thank you very much for being with us today in any case. So it's focused on the fact that all of the time and effort that has gone into developing a player is duly recompensed. This is the reality, not to try and put a commodification on those young players per se. There is a very, very careful distinction that we've got to make, right? So it's important to make sure that all of these registration processes are in place. And if they are not, when you are making a claim, because your player that was with you from the age of 12 to 18 has now moved from your local club in Rwanda, has gone through Qatar, the UAE, and now is plying his trade in Czechia at the age of 22, you're going to be in a position where you're going to have to demonstrate how and why and when that player was with you. If you don't have those registrations in place, and those registrations should be authorized by your football federation, if you don't have all of that in place, it's going to be very difficult to prove. And the legal principle, as always, is he who makes the assertion bears the burden. He who makes the claim needs to back it up. This isn't only in law, this is outside of law. If you're going to say something, you need to prove it, right? So we've always got to have these things in mind. When we're talking about training compensation, solidarity mechanisms, the ability to make claims, we've just got to reverse engineer a little bit and think about it from a practical perspective. If I get to that situation, how can I fortify myself or my club or my academy in the best way possible to be able to make that claim? Simple. Let's get the registration document in place. Let's make sure it's furnished to the local or the relevant football association. If the relevant football association is not doing what it needs to do, or the people in the department of the FA is not doing what they need to do, no problem. I'm going to make sure that my academy has got all of my documents in place. And I'm very delighted to say that some of the experiences we've had, particularly in Africa over the last year, with Brian Vasala, and we did the FFA show on training compensation about 13 or 14 months ago. We do now see more people on the African continent picking these principles up more often than they were previously. Ligue Ndogo in Kenya is a great example. Future Stars in Tanzania is a great example. And these are leaders. So it's important that we continue to spread the word and ensure that people are doing the right things from the outset, so you don't find yourself stuck in 2, 3, 4 years' time when you're actually eligible to claim some money.
Absolutely.
I agree, Dave. Dave, looking at a question we've got from Jabu Mtwa, I'll give you my opinion, obviously, and then perhaps you and Shane can pivot off of that. Do you think there could be any better governance structures in African football that monitor compliance to training compensation? So just off the back of what you've said, I obviously think that, look, governance as a whole could increase. And I don't think we should limit it just to Africa. And then when it's in that respect, as Dev has said, I think the fortunate and unfortunate thing, it's a double-edged sword, is that this is your responsibility. It's money you're entitled to. You could have it. But it really, at the end of the day, comes down for me to that club or that academy, making sure that they have their house in order and all of their ducks in a row, administratively speaking. Because the moment you start relying on other people to do that for you, you're then something that's well within your hands, you're placing into the hands of someone else, in my opinion, which, it just sort of seems senseless when it's something that, and obviously there's some academies out there that really face struggles, in Africa, in India, in all sorts of developing countries. There's some major challenges out there. And I think what's important we'll obviously get back to later in the discussion is this governance and administrative, these steps that need to be taken. They're important, but they're surely not the only reason why some money gets left on the table. There's a number of other reasons out there. And then I see Jabu's follow-up was that clubs in South Africa, in my case, we're there with you, seem not to be encouraged by SAFA nor the PSL to follow up on or administer these payments. And perhaps I just want to see your thoughts, Shane and Dev, on how dispute resolution and resolution of disputes and having an active association to go to be able to handle these disputes sort of ties in hand with good governance of football entities, stakeholders in football.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I think I can touch. Sorry, Rolf, go for it.
Sorry to interject you.
No worries.
Yeah, I want to thank Jabu for that question, and just to inform all our other delegates that where you ask your question doesn't matter. The platform doesn't matter. Whether it's YouTube, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's Facebook, all the questions still come up before our panelists, and they still see the questions. You don't have to ask all the questions on the 5 different platforms in order to get it to the front. I think to also go in on the question that Jabu asked. Earlier, Jan spoke about teams that are formed merely for the love of the game. And it's those teams that unfortunately get left behind, where they don't follow up on administrative issues, they don't register players, where unfortunately, as long as they rock up on the field and they get to play, they get to enjoy their football, and they go home at the end of the day. But in doing those things, they may develop some really great footballers who may become professionals and go overseas. And when that happens, they're entitled to some money. And unfortunately, for teams that are just in it for the love of the game, they get left behind where they could get some money to better develop their structures and to increase the football economy, as was said earlier. But they don't get to do that. So in my opinion, I think the FAs have to step in. It's not enough that all coaches and players have to go online to read these rules themselves. I think when players are registered, when teams are registered, the FA should step in, give them a form to say this is what you should do in this instance. When a player goes and signs a professional contract here, this is what you're entitled to. Because unfortunately, as much as we may keep going about this issue, many people don't know about it. And if they don't know about it, it's up to the FAs to step in and assist, because those FAs want the football to develop in their areas. I think it's important that they come in and try to educate administrators, teams, and coaches. I'm keen to hear about this. I'll be wrong. Please just let me know.
No, you're not wrong at all, Rolf. I think two of the most important things, which both everyone has touched on here, is good governance and proper education. Now, a football club or an academy is a business at the end of the day, if you look at it like that. So who are we to say how and where and when you should and can operate your business? At the end of the day, if you want that training compensation claim to go over the line, you need to ensure, as Jan said, you have your ducks in a row. You need to ensure you have the correct documentation. You need to submit it in the proper form. As Dev touched on earlier, you don't want to be filing the wrong claim when you're due it. And at the end of the day, you need to do it within the right time frame. So, Jabu, it's a really great question, because in our experience, we do experience a bit of an issue between maybe some tension between lawyers, clubs, and the FA with respect to communicating with each other. Now, I'm not too sure how this applies going, up into Africa, and maybe Dev can touch on this, but specifically in South Africa, there's a general understanding that provincial associations and the national associations. So let's say, for example, a provincial SAFA body or the national SAFA body, they don't want to be speaking directly to the lawyers, because otherwise they'll be receiving multiple claims and multiple different emails and contacts from various people, and they don't want to have to deal with that. So generally what they do is they say to a club, if there's a claim, or if there's an approach, or if you want a registration card, contact us directly. Copy in your attorneys who can be party to the process, but they should only really play a role if there is a dispute or if there is a need for them to facilitate the claim. At the end of the day, we are here to assist clubs, but we are not there to do the work for them. We want to upskill the clubs so that they can do this work for themselves, so they don't have to spend extra time and money, although sometimes the money isn't, it's well spent getting lawyers involved and sports attorneys. But at the end of the day, we want our clubs to be able to do these things and to make these claims on their own. So there is a bit of tension. I do appreciate that, but what I'd like to see done by some of our FAs, continentally, is perhaps to see some more education on the topic, specifically to the clubs, and maybe upskilling and educating our administrators within each club and academy as to what they need to do to ensure that their academy and club runs like a business properly, and that they do not leave money on the table, and that they do not need to get lawyers involved if there's a dispute, because they would have done what they needed to do already. So I find it quite important that SAFA, for example, if you look in the South African context, in the PSL, should be educating our clubs as to what a training compensation claim is, where in the regulations it provides for making that claim, and most importantly, just good governance. Keep accurate records of players, keep your contracts, ensure that the player has a copy of their contract, and essentially manage your club as a business so that it will continue to stay as a business and not fade away into the abyss of football. So often we see an incredible academy pop up, produce a couple good players, and then all of a sudden it disappears. And we say, well, how's that possible? You know, they had the system set up, the players came out of it that are now professional. What happened? And quite often we find that, you know, monetary constraints held back, you know, their ability to maybe employ someone that could do that work. You know, so often we find a club or an academy is just so fixated on training and getting the players where they need to be and the next game, and you know, I'm under pressure for points, that they forget the backroom, you know, the backroom aspect of running a club. So to answer your question, Jabu, there are better governance structures which we can put in place. FIFA has implemented a system which will hopefully start working in the next few months and a year, so that we don't have to have this worry. And yes, the PSL and SAFA and leagues do have an obligation to do a little bit more, I think, to upskill and educate our clubs. Dev, anything to touch on there?
Yeah, I think I agree with what all of you, yourself, Shane, Ralph, and Jan, mentioned in relation to Jabo's question. But I would say it's a wider situation rather than simply an African football situation. Governance structures can be improved all over the place, and Shane mentioned that FIFA is currently working on certain mechanisms which will assist, particularly with training compensation and solidarity payments. I don't think, Shane, unfortunately, I don't think it's something that we're talking about for months. I think it's going to be delayed a little bit longer from my private understanding, probably the next couple of years. But there's always room for maneuver and improvement when we talk about governance and governance structures that can assist in monitoring payments and assisting income generation for these clubs. I think there's absolutely always room for maneuver, but it all starts with keeping your own house in order. It's the easiest thing in the world to do, just to make sure that you've got yourself on point. Now, I've just seen a question here from Gawa Sportive, and if I can just jump onto that very, very briefly, because I think it actually ties into what we're discussing right now. If an academy gets to set their documents straight after a player has made one or two moves, or basically if there's been a delay after the player has left the academy, can they proceed with picking up from the next move? Well, in theory, you can, as long as you're within the limitation period of 2 years. In theory, you can, but how probative is your claim going to be, and how likely is it that your claim is going to be successful, determines on how strongly you can back up your claim with all the documents you've got. Ultimately, if you're putting together documents that are post-prepared, rather than documents that were contemporaneous and were being prepared at the time of the player's registration, it's going to be more difficult to persuade the panel that you're making a claim in good faith. Now, we've had a couple of claims recently where academies have tried to do something loosely similar. And in fact, we're in a situation right now, well, loosely in a situation right now, which I think is going to get settled. So it's probably not going to get all the way through to the final tribunal, where there's a dispute between the grassroots academy and the federation, because the federation is effectively saying that as the academy doesn't exist or no longer exists, let's say, the federation is eligible to claim that money and then put it into their pot for youth development. Now, as to whether that's something that would actually happen or whether the federation would simply take that money and use it elsewhere is a different story. The academy, however, is saying, no, we do exist. These are our documents. So we appreciate that these documents are post-prepared and maybe not in the best way that they should be, but the money should be coming to us. So I think it makes it more difficult. You just put yourself in muddy waters if you're going to prepare those documents later on. In some instances, it can't be helped. I fully understand that. the dynamic nature of football is such that you're, as Shane was talking about, you're running a camp, then you're sending 1 or 2 players on trial, you're taking care of 22 other players, you've got to deal with all of their parents and their brothers and sisters and so on and so forth, and then you're doing this every single year. So sometimes it's not possible to keep on top of everything. I appreciate that. So of course, in that kind of situation, get your documents done as early as you possibly can. But that doesn't take away from the reality that the longer you wait for your documents to come in, the more difficult your claim is going to become. It's not impossible to win. It's not impossible to win. But it certainly makes it more challenging for you, and even more challenging for us as counsel that might be representing you. So do endeavor to do things as quickly and as contemporaneously as possible at all times. So I hope, Kava Sportive, I hope that also answers your question as well.
And I think, Dev, that feeds into what you were saying. It's not always that academies and so on just don't make those claims, but often they can be flawed claims. So essentially, I think for all our delegates and academies out there is try to get yourselves, run it like it's a business. No one loves administration. I'm sure Dev being the founder of Palmars, Shane and I being the founders of Javelin, Ralph having his own counsel practice as well. Admin is never the fun part of any job. I think it's always the boring part, but it has to be a position where it does get seen as a business so that you really make sure, you wouldn't see a company just writing off massive debts. Obviously here you have to go a step further. It's not just issuing an invoice. You have to collect and follow up that claim. But I just think it's vital that, it comes down to it not being the association's governance, really. You first got to start with your own governance, and then I think you can start looking at where the other problems are and try to change that way. But yeah.
And if I may just jump in from there, and I'm also very conscious, or we're also very conscious about the time that all of you have taken to watch us on a Friday evening or a Friday afternoon, wherever you're watching from today. And we haven't actually spoken about solidarity mechanism at all so far. Now, I've mentioned that, and I'm actually going to go backwards ever so slightly, just to talk about money on the table and training compensation and tracking players, which is something that Shane referred to earlier. Now, there's a bit of a misnomer that I've heard on the market in Africa and in other jurisdictions where people say, this player is going to be worth money, so of course we're going to be tracking him. There's no way that an academy would lose track of a player if he is worth money. And I say he also, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I say he specifically because at the moment training compensation is primarily for male players. We're not talking about female players. The female football market does not have training compensation principles applicable to it at the moment. That's just a quick side point. So that's why we're always talking about he. Now, yes, in principle, you might think that if you've got a player that is likely to move to X club and then Y club and Z club and potentially bring money in, that your club or your academy or your grassroots organization would be tracking that player. However, as I mentioned before, the reality of working in a football club or an academy is so dynamic that it's not always easy to keep track of these people. It's a bit like running a school and then having one eye on your alumni 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the line, when you're still dealing with hundreds of people in the now, and then everything else that comes with it. So tracking players is sometimes a challenging aspect, and often the clubs that sign the players are not going to be forthright and track you down and say, oh, by the way, we owe you money. Usually they're quite amiable if they receive communication. We've done a few in the Premier League recently. We did a claim to Chelsea only a short while ago, and they were very amiable, very, very amiable. Usually most clubs, big clubs, small clubs, when they do receive an email about solidarity payments or training compensation, they're generally quite happy to deal with it without having to go into a dispute situation. But by the same token, they're not going to chase you up and tell you that they owe you money. So tracking players is more difficult than you might anticipate. So it's important to try and put as many mechanisms you can in place, whether they're formal or informal, simply by way of having communications with people that are following these individuals around the world, to ensure that you're always abreast of the situation. And then with solidarity payments, it's a similar thing. I mean, Shane touched upon training compensation and solidarity before. In the most simple form possible, just to ensure that we're all on the same page and we demystify it, training compensation is purely payment that is made on the basis of the training period until the age of 23. Solidarity mechanism is a payment that is made from a transfer fee for a player that is moving from one club to another for a transfer for an amount designated for the player's registration. Like Cristiano Ronaldo has just moved from Juventus to Manchester United. He's 36 years old, and his training clubs from the ages of 12 to 23 would still be eligible to claim a small percentage of that transfer fee. Okay, but training compensation dies at the age of 23, irrespective of where the player moves afterwards. So it's always important to delineate between the two, because I often have, and I'm sure Shane and Jan and Ralph, you'll agree, I often speak to clubs, and it's quite alarming how easy it is for people to get these principles mixed up. Solidarity payments only come in if one of your former players has moved to another club for a transfer fee. Otherwise, we're talking about training compensation, and training compensation as a principle is no longer applicable after the age of 23. So I hope that also ensures that some of those who might not have been clear are now clear. And if anyone has got any questions, then I'm sure we'll all be happy to help them.
Yeah, and that, Dev, you touched on it now, it feeds back into the record keeping, why that's so important, and tracking players moving forward is because it would be so easy to forget 10 years down the line when your player has developed into this world-class player that you are due a small fee. And like I said, it might end up being small, but with the transfer fees nowadays for players like Ronaldo, I mean, we could be looking at a small fee of a couple €100,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 euros, which is not money to be played with when it comes to these development clubs. So it's quite important that we get proper administration. I think Naki has touched on a question: how do we get grassroots associations and academies to build this data from the get-go? I think what's key here is that we need football administrators in clubs and academies to take this role on, to ensure that we leave the coaching to the coaches, and we leave the business and finance to the finance guy, and the legal to the legal, and the administration aspect be left to a club secretary or to someone that has designated that duty, to ensure every player has their contract. We have a copy of that contract signed and countersigned by both parties. The player is registered. Any communication we receive from the FA is kept on file. So you essentially, I know I've touched on it again, it can be digital or it can be paper form. Have that file with all of the communications you've had. Issues with respect to that player's agent, emails back and forth about additional expenses. Keep all of that information you have and record keep it, so that if any issues pop up about a player who said, no, I did this or I did that, you can just go back and easily look at it. So no, I don't mean to be condescending to say it's as simple as keeping records, but it generally can be that easy. That if from day one you keep all the records, every single day something happens, you add it to that file, I can assure you 5 years down the line, when you need to look for a document 5 years back, it'll be very easy to find it. And then just lastly, I'll touch on maybe one more topic, Dev. We can talk about a little bit of a nuanced trick that some sports lawyers will be able to assist clubs with in ensuring that the buying club makes that payment for training compensation or solidarity in the contract. It's a nuanced aspect we can discuss. But Jabu, just to touch on your question about CAF, and continental associations and confederations having an obligation to implement more robust mechanisms. I think it's a two-sided coin. Yes, as the Continental Confederation, they have an obligation to ensure that all the clubs and associations in their continent are running properly. But at the same time, I'd like to say that the mechanisms are there. They've been in place since 2001. So it's not only the obligation of CAF to do this. I think the system is in place. People know how it works, hopefully. And if they don't, that's what we are here for. And so we mustn't place all the burden on CAF or the continental associations to do all the work. I think the mechanisms are there. Clubs ought to know what they need to do. And the system is set up for them to receive these funds that are due to them if they know how and if they implement the proper procedures to get that money. So yeah, we don't want to keep too much. We don't want to take everyone's time, as Dev touched on a Friday evening. But if there's anything else you guys want to touch on, maybe we could wrap up with a final closing understanding the topic.
I quickly want to touch on quickly here is just because we said there's other reasons, because we're in a position now where it's admin this, get all your documents together and everything will be fine. But there are other reasons, obviously, as well. And one, I know with Jabu having a couple of questions about South Africa, and this isn't a bad thing. The rules permit it. It's the way it works, unfortunately. But we also notice a couple of claims go, and I don't know, Dev, if you notice this in other parts of Africa, but where some claims also seem to slip away is we have at the moment a bit of a merry-go-round buying and selling system of clubs. Where clubs can buy status. They can buy a club that has a Premier League status, and then they effectively gain promotion in that way. And, when you have sort of these buyers of clubs dropping such big amounts of money on a football club, these little things get forgotten about very quickly, and some of these claims tend to fall away. So I'm just trying to illustrate that there are other reasons. I don't know what your experience has been of that throughout more the north of Africa, Dev. But that's something we've definitely found in South Africa, just as an example.
That's very interesting. That's really very interesting that you mentioned that. We've got a situation in Eastern Europe at the moment, which is loosely similar to what you've alluded. I would say. So it's another thing that we've got to be extremely cautious about with regards to how it works. I mean, there are plenty of nuances, but the buying of a license, the disappearance of academies or clubs, the changing of names, the changing of status in the leagues. One of the situations that we're working with at the moment is to do with a club that, it's a dispute on training compensation between a club that was in the Premier League, well, not the English Premier League, but the Premier League in its own jurisdiction, and due to financial difficulties, has now dropped down into the bottom division. However, the claim is being made on the basis that when the player left their club, the player was a Premier League player, and therefore they want the amount that would be afforded in training compensation to a Category 1 club. Whereas they're not a Category 1 club now. So there are so many different vitiating factors that we can consider. So I think, going back onto your point, Jan, you're absolutely correct. It's not just all documentation, even though Kahava Sportive has kind of latched onto this just now as well. It's primarily documentation, and it's something that we've all got to focus on. But there are some nuances, which are more the exceptions rather than the rules, which we have to consider, which can also impede the ability to make claims or to make successful claims.
Yeah.
Answer to Matt's question there.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, Matt, if there's no national regulations on the topic, always defer back to the FIFA RSTP Article 20 and 21. That'll allow you to figure out what you need to do.
Absolutely, Matt. And with regards to the RSTP, I think what we have to remember is primarily the FIFA regulations are in place for particularly when we talk about transfers and training compensation and things like that, primarily they're in place for activity where there is an international dimension. So it wouldn't automatically apply where we're talking about, a situation that is, let's say, between two Namibian clubs or whatever else it might be. However, there are certain jurisdictions, and Shane and Jan and Ralph, we were talking about this earlier, there are certain jurisdictions that do have their own internal mechanisms within their own jurisdiction. However, the FIFA regulations are primarily there for application when there is an international dimension taking place. And for solidarity payments, now the FIFA RSTP or FIFA regulations do put into place the ability for clubs to be able to claim money if one of their players has gone abroad and then has moved in the same league. So, for example, what we could talk about is Victor Wanyama, a Kenyan national team captain. Until today, I believe, he's just been stripped of the captaincy, if I'm not mistaken. Victor Wanyama, of course, came from Kenya, was at Nairobi City Stars earlier on, then I think he was somewhere else. I can't remember. Went on to play for Celtic, and then moved to Southampton in England, so across the border, because Celtic, with the Scottish jurisdiction, Celtic to Southampton would have been an international transfer and would have meant that the clubs back in Kenya would have got money. But from Southampton went to Tottenham. Now that was a transfer that took place in England alone. Previously, that kind of transfer would not have afforded the clubs back in Kenya the ability to claim solidarity payments from the transfer fee between Tottenham and Southampton. However, moving forward now, if there is a transfer within a certain league, then the training clubs in another jurisdiction will still be able to receive payments. So there are certain things that have applicability for national jurisdictions, but primarily, Matt, it's to do with things that are going on internationally.
So you have a question, Deb, from Michael from the USA. If we run out of time, Michael, take note of this document, Circular 1726 from FIFA, released last year, July 2020. That'll set out all the categories you'll need if it's not contained in your local documents. But I think Debbie had a question for you about the categories.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 1726, we are conscious about time because the gaffer, the CEO and the founder of the Football Foundation for Africa and the Africa Football Business Show is scrutinizing us at the moment on screen. So please do have a look at that. It's very easily accessible on the FIFA website, or you could probably just Google it. It might be easier than navigating through the FIFA website. But with regards to different categories, now you're not going to find the categories in RSTP itself. In RSTP, what you'd find is the let's say for solidarity payments, you can find the percentage that would be owed to a club within particular years. So the training period would be deemed as the ages of 12 through to 23. Now, if a player like Cristiano Ronaldo moved from Juventus to Manchester United for, 15 million plus incentives, the clubs that he was registered to during the ages of 12 to 23 would be eligible for a small percentage of that amount. So from the ages of 12 to 15, they would be eligible for 5% of 5% of that total compensation. And then from the ages of 17 through to 23, they would be eligible for 10% of the total 5% of that compensation. So let's say 5% of 15 million is 750 grand, if my maths is not mistaking me. So any club he was with from 12 to 15 would be eligible to claim cumulatively or separately 5% for each year of 750,000 pounds. So what you'll find, euros or dollars or whatever it might be. So what you can find in the RSTP is some of the ways in which calculations are made. But in terms of the categorization, that is something that you'll find on the circulars that are regularly put out by by FIFA and also by UEFA and CAF and CONMEBOL. All of the confederations themselves, they also put out their own categorization documents, because ultimately a category 1 at UEFA may not necessarily correlate to being a category 1 elsewhere. So each confederation has its own categorization. Those documents should be fairly accessible. And then when we have a cross-continental transfer, so to speak, and there's training compensation or solidarity involved, or training compensation involved, then you'd have to look at the categorization between both confederations and then try and work out whether there's going to be an averaging, or whether it's simply going to be from the larger club to the smaller club. That's putting it in a nutshell. There's quite a lot more to talk about this, Michael. So, please look at those documents, and if you need, feel free to get in touch with any of us after the show, and we'll try and help you out further.
Yeah.
See, we
my
have
apologies for interrupting.
Richard.
Yes, there's a question, Richard Hall. So sorry. Richard is asking a very important question. He's asking that many European teams are looking for compensation waivers in return for higher sell-on percentages. How do you guys view this practice?
Cheeky.
Let Dev jump in.
I think, cheeky is one way of putting it. I think it depends on the context. I don't dislike the practice, to be perfectly honest, because ultimately it's a mechanism that is there for the clubs to be able to negotiate. Now, the reality is that a lot of clubs in Europe also don't have financial power or financial prowess. We talk about Europe as this whole, and it's easy to look at the Premier League and think of Europe. It's easy to look at Serie A and just think of Europe. But clubs in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Albania, Belarus, they may not necessarily have the financial power like the English Premier League. They may not have the same financial power as clubs in the Tanzanian Premier League. Let's be perfectly honest. So in that sense, it's often prohibitive for players from Africa to have a training compensation attached to them, because if they're not necessarily good enough to get into your Belgian league or your French league, but they are good enough to go to Europe and potentially build up from there, it's prohibitive to have a 10,000 euro fee attached to them when a club from Kosovo can't afford it. So in that sense, I don't dislike the ability for clubs to say, okay, we're going to bring you over to Latvia. You're going to play in the Latvian top division. And maybe from there, you can move on to Bosnia or to Bulgaria or Romania. But we're not going to pay your club 10 grand right now. However, if the player moves on, we're going to give you 25% of the sell-on fee. And there's a sharing of risk there. I think there is room for it. What I don't like is that a lot of clubs in Europe, or a lot of clubs with more financial power, feign that they don't have the financial power, and then they somehow use this to put clubs in Africa in a position of enforcing them by way of duress to sign up to these agreements. So, Richard, from my perspective, I don't think the practice itself is the issue. I think the way that it's adopted by certain clubs is problematic.
Yeah. For fear of Brian killing all of us for going over time, I just want to touch one topic there, Deb. I agree with you, but what I just like to say is be careful to forego an amount that's due to you in favor of an amount that may not come if something goes wrong.
Absolutely.
So yes, the practice may work. It's about how it happens, but that training compensation is due to you no matter what. So be careful that they promise you a sell-on fee that maybe doesn't materialize, and then you've given up both fees and you're sitting with your hands, what do I do now? I can't claim anything. So that's just my 2 cents on the topic.
Absolutely.
But
very good point.
Thank you so much for all the questions, guys. It's been a great pleasure to talk to everyone and engage in this discussion. I feel we should come back and have another discussion on the topic and maybe encapsulate a few other topics in it. But thank you so much, Brian, for listening to us go on.
I also just want to say thanks. Inevitably, I think there's a lot of points we didn't quite get to that we would have wanted to discuss, but for me, it's always more relevant to discuss the points that you want to discuss. It makes it you get a bit more value out of it rather than us sitting here with a list of questions we need to ask and no one really gains anything. So yeah, thanks for all the questions.
Yeah. Again, thank you to the delegates. I think we've had questions from almost every continent. So I know some guys are watching us in the middle of the night. We're complaining that it's 7 p.m., but so some people are staying up in the middle of the night watching us. And I know that those in the US might be watching us at lunchtime. So we appreciate the time. We appreciate the questions. We've been viewing many different platforms, and I think the ultimate platform has been provided with Brian, and we thank you for that, Brian.
Well, thank you very much, Jens, for that excellent, informative session. I think the audience speaks to the quality of the discussion that we've had today. Very, very good engagement up until now. So my appreciation to Javelin Sports and Parmas for putting these together. And for sure, we need another session. It's always good to bring different perspectives, different ideas, but always follow the rule of law, which is very important. And in this case, the rules that come from FIFA, from our own jurisdictions. And yeah, we appreciate what you have done for us today. And we look forward to hosting you again. Thank you very much, Shane Wefer, Ralph Mokwala, Yan Nel, and Dev Kumar Palmas today wearing the Palmas hat, but is also very much part of the Football Foundation for Africa as one of our advisory board members. So we really appreciate the input that you're giving. Just to encapsulate the whole discussion, I think it's very important for me. This is very important, as some of our users put it, for Africa especially, where there are many challenges, lots of gaps in knowledge, the technical know-how that sometimes starves, especially our grassroots football, from the required, the needed resources. When we talk about record keeping, we need people to do this record keeping, but how do you pay these people to do the record keeping? We need to ensure that the resources trickle back down. And one of the ways in which we can do this is by ensuring our training, compensation, and solidarity mechanism payments actually make way to the rightful stakeholders in this case. I'm also just thinking from the top of my head, there was a lot of questions, I think, from Jabu specifically, asking for a concerted effort, maybe from the African continent. Can something be done at the CAF level, even at the AU level? We all know that these training compensation and solidarity mechanism payments came about as a result of the Bosman ruling and are very much aligned to the EU labor laws. But what are we doing as Africa to make sure that they also align to our own laws? And it's also good that we start to harmonize. I've had a lot of this is what we do in South Africa. We don't know about other countries in Africa. I think it's important that we also start learning and thinking together as a continent, so that we get to drive more resources into grassroots football across the continent. So thank you very much to our guests. Thank you very much as well to our sponsors, starting with Palmas, who are here, OTB Africa, See Beyond Leadership Forum, iSport Learn, the Football Business Academy. For our two educational partners, that are iSport Learn and the Football Business Academy, feel free to inquire later for more information about their courses. I think this is also very important. We need to have a knowledge-driven football economy, and some of these institutions are providing that knowledge. So if there is a way in which we can get people, especially from the continent, to attend these courses, then we get to build the capacity that we need to build the football economy. So with that, I would like to call this to our close. Our next session will be in 2 weeks, where we'll be talking about financing football development in Africa. So feel free to join us again. For our delegates, thank you very much for your active participation today, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Good night.